I trusted her.
My mother spent the last year of her clear mind calling another woman my girl. It took me almost that long to understand. She meant it literally, as in, someone else's. I am standing outside the house I grew up in, my hand raised to knock on a door I used to walk through without thinking twice. This is the 4th time in 6 weeks I have come here, and the 3rd time I will be told, gently, kindly, that my mother is resting, that this isn't a good time, that maybe I should call ahead next time. My name is Diane, and before I tell you what happened to my mother Margaret, I need you to understand something. Nobody broke into our lives and took what mattered. Somebody was invited in, one small kindness at a time, until there was no room left for the rest of us. The following story is fictional, but it is built from a pattern that repeats itself in real homes, in real families, all across this country, more often than most people realize. I want you to hold on to that fact, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly how it happens and exactly how easily it could happen to someone you love. What you are about to see did not begin with a crime. It began with a fall, an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a bruised hip, and a phone call from an agency offering help. It began with someone showing up when the rest of us could not, and being so good at it, so warm, so endlessly patient, that no one thought to ask what she might be taking in exchange for everything she seemed to give. Somewhere in the weeks that follow, my mother will sit at her own kitchen table and sign a piece of paper she does not fully understand, her hand trembling slightly. Not from fear, but because that is simply what her hands do now. I will not be in the room when it happens, neither will my brother. The only person present will be the one who arranged for it to happen exactly this way, on exactly this day, when my mother was calm and trusting and alone with her. Months later, I will sit in a parked car outside a courthouse, crying in a way I have not cried since I was a child, not because of what was taken, though that number will be large enough to make you sick, but because of how long it took me to believe my own instincts. Here is the question I want you to carry with you through everything that follows, because it is the only question that actually matters in a story like this one. When someone builds a wall around the person you love, one visit denied at a time, one excuse at a time, one quiet redirection at a time, how exactly are you supposed to get a warning through? I didn't know the answer. For most of a year, I doubted myself instead. I want to tell you what that year cost my family, what it nearly cost my mother, and what finally broke that wall down. Because if you are watching this and something in your own life feels a little too familiar right now, I need you to trust that feeling far sooner than I trusted mine. To understand how far things went, you have to understand who my mother was before any of this started. Margaret Whitfield was not a woman who let people push her around. She and my father built a small chain of hardware stores across 3 counties over 35 years, and she ran the books herself until the day she retired, catching errors that accountants twice her age missed. She remembered every employee's birthday. She could tell you, off the top of her head, which supplier had raised prices without telling anyone. She was sharp, she was generous, and she was proud, in the quiet way people are proud when they built something with their own 2 hands and never had to ask anyone for help. That woman is important to remember because she is the same woman who, 2 years later, would not remember signing away nearly $500,000. My father died of a heart attack a little over 2 years before any of this began, and my mother's grief was the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly. She insisted on staying in the house they had shared for 4 decades. She insisted she didn't need anyone checking in on her. For a while that seemed true. Then the small things started. A utility bill that went unpaid for the first time in memory, not because there wasn't money, but because she had simply forgotten it existed. A drive to a grocery store she had shopped at for 20 years that ended with her calling me, confused, 3 streets away from where she meant to be. I told myself she was tired. I told myself grief does strange things to a person's memory. I did not yet have a name for what was actually happening to her mind. My brother Nathan lived 2 states away by then, caught up in a demanding job and a recent divorce, and a teenage daughter who needed him more than any of us wanted to admit. He called our mother every week, sometimes twice, and he told himself those calls were enough. I lived closer, 20 minutes away, but the truth is more complicated than distance. My mother and I had our own history, the kind every mother and daughter accumulates over the years, small hurts that never got said out loud, an old feeling that she had always been harder on me than she was on Nathan, a newer feeling, after my own divorce, that she thought I should be handling my life better than I was. So when she started needing more help than either of us could give her, neither of us was fully present to notice. That absence, more than anything else, is what left the door open. The fall happened on a Tuesday in early spring. My mother slipped getting out of the bathtub and bruised her hip, badly enough to need a walker for 2 weeks. The agency her doctor recommended sent someone out within days, a home health aide named Renee Calloway, to help with meals and medication and the basic tasks my mother suddenly couldn't manage alone. I remember meeting her for the first time in that kitchen, watching her kneel down to be at eye level with my mother while she explained the medication schedule, patient in a way that felt genuine, not performed. I remember thinking, with real relief, that we had gotten lucky. I want to be honest with you about that feeling, because it matters later. Renee was good at this job. That was never the lie. Over the following weeks, Renee organized my mother's medications into a system more careful than anything we had managed ourselves. She cooked meals my mother actually finished, coaxed her into short walks around the block, sat with her through long afternoons when the rest of us were working. My mother began to light up when Renee's car pulled into the driveway. She started introducing her to the neighbors as my girl, the same phrase she used to describe cherished former employees, a term of real affection in my mother's vocabulary, not something either of us thought twice about at first. What we didn't notice, because we had no reason to be looking for it yet, was how quickly Renee became the only person my mother wanted to talk to about anything that mattered. The first small crossing happened so quietly that I only understood its significance months later, looking back. My mother was struggling to keep up with online bill payments, misreading amounts, occasionally paying the same bill twice. Renee offered to help manage it, gently suggesting they set up a joint account so she could handle the routine payments without needing my mother's password every time. It sounded practical. It sounded, honestly, like exactly the kind of help we should have been providing ourselves, and weren't. My mother agreed, and a new account was opened with Renee listed as a secondary signer. It was the same money, moving through the same kinds of bills it always had, except now there were 2 names attached to it instead of 1, and only one of those names fully understood what was happening to the balance. Around the same time, Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that she knew a financial advisor who was far more affordable than the one my mother's late husband had used for decades. My mother, trusting and increasingly tired of managing details she once handled easily, agreed to the switch without consulting either Nathan or me. I did not meet this new advisor for months. I did not know his name until much later. What I knew, in the moment, was only that my mother seemed calmer, more cared for, less burdened by tasks that used to overwhelm her. I told myself that was a good thing. I had no way of knowing yet how much quieter that calm would eventually cost us. It was around this time that I started noticing I was being turned away. I would call ahead, as instructed, and still arrive to find my mother resting, or not feeling up to visitors. Even on days I knew, from Renee's own updates, that my mother had been out walking the neighborhood hours earlier. The first 2 times, I told myself I was overreacting, that caregivers set boundaries for good medical reasons, that I should trust the professional judgment of someone whose entire job was looking after my mother's well-being. The third time, standing on that porch with my hand still raised from a knock nobody answered, something in me finally refused to accept the excuse. I sat in my car afterward for a long time, asking myself a question I didn't like the answer to. Was I imagining this? Or was I being managed the same careful way my mother's medications were being managed? My brother's experience mirrored mine, though from a greater distance. His phone calls with our mother started to feel scripted somehow, Renee's voice audible in the background, gently supplying details our mother struggled to remember, answering questions before our mother finished asking them. When Nathan raised the possibility, carefully, that something felt slightly off, our mother grew defensive in a way that surprised him, insisting Renee had done nothing but help her, that we should be grateful instead of suspicious. I want to be clear about something here, because it is the part of this story people misunderstand most often. My mother was not foolish, and she was not being cruel to us. She was being carefully, patiently managed by someone who understood the rhythms of her confusion better than her own children did, someone who knew exactly which moments to be present for and which ones to make sure we weren't. The turning point came on an ordinary Thursday when a document arrived from a law office neither Nathan nor I recognized, addressed to our mother, referencing a durable power of attorney that named Renee as an alternate agent in the event Nathan became unavailable to act on our mother's behalf. It had already been signed. My mother, when I asked her about it gently, remembered the visit only vaguely, remembered the conversation as her own idea, remembered feeling grateful that Renee had thought to protect her independence without burdening her children. I did not raise my voice. I did not want to frighten her. But I left that house that afternoon and called Nathan from my car, and for the first time, both of us said out loud what we had each been afraid to say alone. Something was very wrong, and we no longer had the luxury of waiting to be certain before we acted. Nathan flew in the following week, and together we sat down with an elder law attorney named Arthur Levinson, a calm, methodical man who had clearly seen this exact pattern more times than he wished he had. He explained, without alarming us further than we already were, how common this kind of situation actually is, how isolation and small incremental permissions accumulate into something that looks, on paper, like a series of reasonable choices made by a competent adult, right up until the moment someone finally adds up the total. He recommended we request full banking records immediately, before any further transfers could occur, and he warned us that the coming weeks would require patience we might not feel we had left. What the records showed, once we finally saw them, was worse than either of us had prepared for. Transfers to accounts neither of us recognized. Withdrawals clustered near an apartment complex, nowhere close to our mother's neighborhood. A significant portion of the money our father had spent 35 years building, moving steadily, quietly, into places it was never supposed to go. My first instinct was to suspect the new financial advisor, the one Renee had recommended, the one who had approved transfers that should have raised obvious questions. It would take weeks of investigation to learn that his failure was negligence rather than conspiracy, a man who simply hadn't done his job, not a co-conspirator in someone else's scheme. That realization didn't bring relief. It only meant the person actually responsible was still, at that point, fully welcome in my mother's home. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My own investigation ran alongside the financial one, driven less by evidence at first than by a daughter's stubborn refusal to keep doubting herself. I started talking to neighbors, beginning with Carol, who had lived across the street from my parents for nearly 30 years. Carol told me she had stopped by 3 times over the past 2 months and been turned away every time, told my mother was resting, told maybe another day would be better. She also mentioned something that stuck with me for days afterward. A package she'd noticed on the porch, addressed to our house but bearing a different last name entirely, one she assumed was a shipping mistake at the time. It was the first thread suggesting that Renee Calloway might not be the only name this woman had ever used. That single detail sent me looking in a direction I hadn't considered before, and what I found unsettled me more than anything else so far. A brief mention, buried in an old local news archive from a neighboring state, referencing a home health aide investigated in connection with a prior elder financial exploitation case, no name attached to the public record, the matter apparently settled privately rather than prosecuted. I couldn't prove it was her. Not yet, but the pattern it described, an aide who became indispensable, who grew close enough to an elderly client to gain financial access, who left quietly before anyone built a case strong enough to stop her, matched what was happening to my mother with a precision that made my hands shake reading it. Confronting my mother directly was, without question, the hardest conversation of my life. Nathan and I sat with her one evening and gently explained what we had found, the transfers, the power of attorney, the pattern we suspected in Renee's past. My mother did not react with relief at being warned. She reacted with fear and confusion, protective of the one person who had shown up for her every single day when the rest of us, in her mind, had not. She grew agitated, insisted we were exaggerating, insisted Renee loved her, and in that moment, I understood something about these situations that no article had prepared me for. Rescuing someone who cannot fully recognize they need rescuing is its own particular kind of heartbreak, one where the person you're trying to save may fight you every step of the way. Renee, sensing the shift in the household, became noticeably more careful in the weeks that followed. Spending slowed. Her manner toward Nathan and me grew subtly cooler, though never openly hostile, and she began, in small comments to our mother, suggesting that Nathan and I were being controlling, that our concern was really about controlling her money rather than protecting her well-being. It was a quiet, effective seed to plant, and for a while, it worked exactly as intended, our mother growing more guarded with us, more loyal to the one person who had never, in her experience, made her feel like a burden. We hired a private investigator on Arthur's recommendation, someone experienced specifically in cases like ours, and within 2 weeks, he had confirmed what Carol's stray comment had first suggested. Renee Calloway had operated under at least one other name in a neighboring state, with an employment gap in her history lining up almost exactly with the timeline of an elderly client's death and a family financial dispute that never became public. She had not been prosecuted. She had simply been allowed to disappear before anyone built a case strong enough to hold her accountable, and that, more than anything else, explained how she had learned to do this so well. She wasn't hiding from a first offense. She was repeating a pattern that had already worked once before, on a family too exhausted or too private to pursue it any further than a quiet settlement behind closed doors. We brought everything we had to Detective Kayla Ruiz in the Financial Crimes Unit, and she was honest with us from the very first meeting about how difficult these cases are to build. A victim whose testimony a defense attorney can challenge based on her diagnosis. Family members with limited legal standing until formal guardianship is established. Agencies that move slowly, sometimes reluctantly, to investigate their own employees. Her strategy was to build the paper trail first, methodically, before we ever confronted Renee directly again, because a confrontation without evidence would only give her time to disappear the way she apparently had before. It meant weeks of waiting, weeks of watching Renee continue caring for our mother each day while we quietly assembled the case against her, one of the strangest and most difficult periods either Nathan or I had ever lived through. The moment everything nearly slipped away from us came on an ordinary afternoon, when Renee, using the power of attorney she still held, attempted to liquidate a certificate of deposit that represented a significant portion of what remained of our mother's savings. The bank's fraud department flagged the request for manual review, a small bureaucratic delay that, as it turned out, arrived within hours of Detective Ruiz filing the paperwork necessary to freeze the account entirely. If that timing had gone even slightly differently, if the transfer had cleared a single day earlier, there might not have been enough left to build a case around at all. I think about that timing more than almost anything else from that entire year. What the financial forensics team eventually uncovered went far beyond a single bad year in my mother's life. Renee had used at least 2 other identities across 2 other states, always following the same careful method, positioning herself as an indispensable caregiver, isolating her client from family, securing legal access to finances, and then withdrawing steadily enough to avoid triggering immediate suspicion, before disappearing ahead of any real investigation. Across all 3 cases combined, investigators estimated the damage at well over $1 million. One of her earlier victims, an elderly widower in another state, had died before any restitution was ever made, meaning some families would never see a single dollar returned, a detail that made the stakes of what remained recoverable for our own mother feel unbearably urgent. The day of the arrest is one I will never fully describe without my voice catching. Police arrived at my mother's home in the late morning, and Renee's composure, the same calm, warm manner that had won over an entire family, finally cracked in front of us for the first time. My mother stood in the doorway, confused and devastated, watching the woman she called her girl placed in handcuffs in her own driveway, and I don't think, even in that moment, she fully understood why. There was no triumph in that scene, only grief, layered over grief that was already there, and the quiet, sickening realization that the person who had made my mother feel less alone all year had also been the one slowly taking everything else away from her. During questioning, Renee initially maintained that everything she had received was a gift, freely given by a woman who adored her, and for a moment, listening to secondhand accounts of that interview, I felt a flash of real fear that a jury might actually believe her. It was only when Detective Ruiz laid out the pattern from the other states, the other names, the other elderly clients who had trusted her in exactly the same way, that her composure finally gave out entirely. That was the moment the case stopped being about one confused old woman's word against a caregiver's and became something a jury could actually see clearly for what it was. Arthur uncovered one final detail during the discovery process that still unsettles me to this day. 3 weeks before the arrest, Renee had quietly arranged for a new attorney, not Arthur, to draft a full amendment to my mother's will, naming Renee as primary beneficiary of the entire estate, including the house my parents had lived in for over 40 years. It was scheduled to be signed the very week Nathan first asked about that unexplained bank statement. If we had waited even 7 more days to start asking questions, there might not have been an estate left to protect at all. Because of my mother's diagnosis, protecting her going forward required us to pursue formal guardianship, a process that felt, in its own strange way, like another form of bureaucracy, nearly working against the very people it was designed to help. I sat in a courtroom and watched a judge gently question my mother about her own understanding of her situation, and it remains one of the most difficult scenes I have ever lived through, watching my mother try, and sometimes fail, to answer simple questions about her own life with the clarity she once had without effort. At trial, the prosecution laid out the full pattern across all 3 states, while the defense argued for reduced culpability, framing the money as gifts given willingly by a woman who was, in their words, simply generous. My mother was asked to testify, and during a brief window of real clarity that afternoon, she delivered a single quiet sentence that undid the defense's entire argument more effectively than any financial record could have. She said she had trusted Renee the way she trusted her own children, and that trust was never meant to be taken and spent like it belonged to someone else. Renee was convicted on multiple counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and related fraud charges connected to the other states once the cases were formally linked. At sentencing, there was a restitution order attached to the conviction, though Arthur was honest with us from the beginning that full recovery was unlikely, given how much had already been spent or hidden across multiple accounts. Renee received meaningful prison time, and I want to tell you that the moment the sentence was read, I felt something like triumph. What I actually felt was exhausted relief, tangled together with grief, for the year none of us could get back, and for a version of trust between my mother and me that would take a very long time to fully repair. Months later, Detective Ruiz shared one final detail that reshaped how I understood everything that had happened. The name Renee Calloway had used across every one of her cases was not, in fact, her original name. Before any of this began, years earlier, she had genuinely cared for her own dying mother, by every account with real devotion, before something in her own life came apart entirely. Financial ruin, addiction, a collapse none of us ever learned the full details of, and that devotion curdled, over time, into something else entirely. I don't share that detail to excuse what she did to my mother. I share it because it is the truest, strangest part of this story. That the instinct to care for someone and the instinct to exploit them can, in the wrong circumstances, come from the very same place. Today, my mother lives with more support around her than she ever needed before, and I am there far more often than I used to be, not out of guilt, though the guilt is still there some days, but because I finally understand how quickly presence can be replaced if you leave too much space for it to happen. She doesn't remember every detail of that year clearly anymore, and some days I am grateful for that mercy. What she does remember, in the moments that matter most, is that I am there. We sit in her garden some afternoons and say very little, and it is enough. If there is one thing I want you to take from everything I've told you, it's this. Renee Calloway didn't target a broken family. She targeted an ordinary one, the kind with old wounds that never quite got spoken aloud, long silences that felt normal until they weren't, people who loved each other, but hadn't said so recently enough. That is the part of this story worth remembering long after the details of the money fade. Isolation, not cruelty, is the real weapon in almost every story like this one, and the only real defense against it is showing up, consistently, long before a crisis ever forces you to. I'll leave you with the same question I've been sitting with since that year finally ended. Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own parents' life, pushed gently to the margins by someone new who seemed, on the surface, like nothing but a blessing? Would you have noticed the wall being built around someone you love, one small excuse at a time? Or would you have doubted your own instincts the way I doubted mine for far too long?